Welcome to HCD's Mindset. I'm Michelle Nigella.
And I'm Kathryn Ambrose.
We are on a mission to help you identify what consumer science innovations have a lot of untapped value or are too good to be true.
So join us for more curious conversations as we try to make sense of the complex but fascinating world of human behavior.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to HCD's Mindset. It is I'm just going to keep saying this, it's your favorite host, Kathryn.
And Michelle.
And we are so excited today to be joined by this lovely guest that we have been put in contact with recently, and you'll be hearing more from him in the future with NeuroU. But today we have with us Dan Alferov. Welcome to the show, Dan. How are you doing today?
Hi guys, thank you so much for the wonderful welcome. I'm doing well. It's finally sunny in Toronto here, so the spirits are brighter. Spring is here, full of energy again, so lovely to chat.
Awesome. So the way we often do like the first starting of talking about you as the subject is really about your origin story. Now, before we jump into that, can you tell us a little bit maybe about what it is that you do and the company that you work for?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the director of empathy analytics for Heartbeat AI. And so Heartbeat AI is a company that focuses on using semi-supervised AI approaches to analyzing language and text for the purposes of understanding human experience. So we view human experience through an emotional lens primarily. And our goal is to use empathy and perspective taking for different groups to solve business challenges in a variety of industries. So we focus on healthcare, human resources, and market research as kind of our three primary.
Now, you've said a lot of really important things that I want to dive into, but we can get to those in a bit. Let's talk about you, Dan. How did you become Dan?
I mean, well, I was born and then, everything.
Okay, I can help guide you on this. So where did you go to school? What were you interested in studying?
Right. Yeah. So my background, I studied at the University of Toronto. Initially, I kind of went into it wanting to study neuroscience. I had an extensive research background for cognitive psychology. There's a bunch of random noise in my background. Let me know if it's being picked up.
We don't even hear it.
Yeah,
okay, great. Thank you. So I went to the University of Toronto for neuroscience initially. I used to do a lot of cognitive psychology work. So looking at neurocorrelates of conscious awareness, doing some other research with mental health related challenges. And then I kind of hit this wall where I was like, doing this basic research is fantastic, and I have such a strong passion for it. But I started to really question kind of what that meant for me in terms of my fulfillment and what impact I felt that research was having. And so I kind of turned more towards the behavioral research side because I felt that, neuroscience encapsulates a lot of things. But for me, what kind of draws me to it is the ability to understand people and kind of get at this innate humanness that we all share. And so that's what kind of pushed me towards also majoring in economics and then math and looking at different ways how we can model behavior and understand it, in aggregate across individuals.
I think that is a big testament to what we believe as, dare I say, like applied consumer neuroscientists. And a big thing that I also find critical from what I saw with my master's degree too, is that an interdisciplinary approach is really the only way that we'll ever be able to chip away at the human experience. It can't be encapsulated in one.
I mean, humans are complicated. You were talking about what it is innately to be human. Well, that is a big mouthful right there, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
And Dan, I know that you and I spoke offline a little bit, and you shared with me that you attended the Brain Mind Institute. Was that what you were alluding to? Like, what was the foundational lessons that you learned there that you took with you when you were studying economics and, your other studies?
Yeah, well, I'm a science fair kid at heart. So I've been involved in the science fair community since I could walk. And I was lucky enough to compete at both the international level with my research as well as at the Canada-wide level growing up here. And so being at the Brain and Mind Institute was actually before my undergrad. And so I got the opportunity to have mentorship from a bunch of really cool researchers in the cognitive psychology field when I was kind of in high school. And so having that kind of interdisciplinary, but also real world academic experience was something that helped me formulate both my skill set and kind of have an understanding and appreciation for neuroscience as this field that brings together so many other elements of science early on. And I think that kind of mentorship and having access and the privilege to speak with individuals who were so far advanced and so far specialized in neuroscience at a young age really helped me form that perspective and kind of understand, what is my skill set? What do I feel I can bring as a young professional to this field? And that's kind of how I stumbled onto Heartbeat. So, at that point, I got really interested with mental health related challenges. So during my undergrad, I spent a lot of time both as a co-chair for the orientation for incoming students. And so that involved managing, over 800 students in their first exposure to university. And that kind of helped me both as someone who had been through that undergraduate experience and had my own mental health related challenges to really start about thinking about programming for mental health, how we can support students, how different student experiences change, like even if you're just a commuter student versus a non-commuter student, and then don't even get me started on the international student experience. But so all of that stuff kind of snowballed into this idea of, hey, all of the stuff that I'm learning in research and in practice and experimental design can be applied towards helping people in this capacity. And so that's what kind of pushed me towards, okay, let's understand, how can we help empathize with the experiences that people with mental health related challenges are experiencing. And that's when I started doing research into text analytics and, primarily for therapy applications, came across Heartbeat AI. And so my first case study when I was just, signing up for an internship position was actually focused on COVID related mental health challenges and how you would apply text analytics to maybe refer people to resources or support just general community well-being. And so from there, it's kind of spiraled over the last 2 years, and I am where I am now.
That's incredible. And I think that hearing your story in full, even though I'm sure you've left out bits and pieces, you do see a common thread of your interests. And also, like you said, how can you take something that often in academia is a little bit siloed and not really, only specific communities hear about, and how can you bring it to a wider audience, which I do think industry has a little bit more of a grasp of getting that widespread knowledge to just even the layperson is really helpful. But I know you mentioned part of Heartbeat's, part of their objective is this idea of like leading with empathy and trying to understand that type of research. Can you speak a little bit more about what is sentiment analysis? Like, what are you actually doing that makes Heartbeat so unique, and the work that you're doing so unique?
Yeah, of course. So I think sentiment analysis and text analytics in general has exploded, even in my time since I've been at Heartbeat. And so we have this understanding of there are clearly semantic points of, common occurrence between language. There's patterns in how we express ourselves that are prevalent throughout the ways that, now we interact with media, the internet, and, the variety of data sources that you can collect where people talk about their experiences. And so for us at Heartbeat, sentiment analysis goes beyond kind of this idea of how do we quantify what someone is feeling, because when we talk about measuring emotions as a whole, and you guys must know kind of with your neuroscience background, is it's not really a trivial thing to say we're measuring emotions. It's
Oh my
first of
goodness.
all
Anything but.
it's a multimodal thing. Some of
Yeah.
it happens unconsciously, and then some of it happens consciously. And then we talk about this whole pathway of, hey, I'm feeling something. My brain already subconsciously is aware that I'm feeling something. I may not be. I have to interpret those signals and then make a decision based on them. And so when you look at that complexity, and I laughed the other day at actually the figure you posted, Michelle, about the brain. And what cracked me up, and I don't mean to be like pretentious or anything as someone with neuroscience background, but the first comment was like, can I find the source and like use it? And I was like, what are you going to use this for? Like, that's not the point. And
I know, I thought that was really funny too, but also there's a link. There was a website that was at the very.
I can share. We'll share the image that we're talking about.
But I think it's a really important point to bring up because, Kathryn, you were mentioning that, perhaps in industry, we think a little bit more broadly, right, about some of these topics, but in that there's a lot of danger.
Yeah.
Because, the one thing I always kind of joke about, quote unquote, neuromarketing, which was, the early 2010s, version of looking at, sentiment and emotion and, is that they were taking very esoteric information from academia, which is done, in a very sterile environment, very controlled environment. Sometimes the information was from a dish, right? And somehow taking that esoteric little piece of information and blowing it out into something that is often overgeneralized and misused and misunderstood. So while I think there is great value to bringing something to, a broader understanding and a broader application, there's a lot of danger in that as well. And I think you probably face that a lot in what you do, because I think ultimately, in industry, people want a simple and straightforward answer. So when they tell you, okay, look at this thing and tell me how the person feels, that's basically what they're asking you to do, right? So this idea of measuring emotion, even though it is so complicated, and you have images like, here's what the brain is basically doing, none of which is emotion, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's all over the place. Like
it's all over the place. So like, how do you deal with that and trying to explain, because you can't exactly explain the complexity of the whole thing when ultimately people just want a measure of what's going on with their consumers.
Right. And so this is kind of the distinction that I think we make at Heartbeat. And one of the things that I stand by around the transparency of it is I don't think frameworks are inherently bad. Right. And so what we do a lot of the time in neuroscience and at Heartbeat is we create a behavioral framework, or we create a linguistics-based framework to try to say that by looking at these differences in how different consumer groups express themselves, we can understand those dynamics, then apply a human critical thinking based context based on what we know about that experience of, interacting with a product or interacting with a service, and then try to extrapolate why are those differences happening. And we happen to use emotions as the vehicle to explain that kind of context beyond just, extracting what are people talking about in a service experience, like on a plane, like comfy seats versus good food. There's key emotional elements that are kind of evinced from experiencing each one of those things. And it's our job to kind of pick up on those fingerprints and then do the detective work behind why those might be arising across different groups that might have different needs, different value systems, etc. So I think that's kind of a long-winded answer, but the idea is what we tell to clients is that we are looking at this through one modality. And this one modality can provide us some information about the semantic context of what people are writing about and the dynamics in their emotional expression. Using the two of those, we can sort of get at what we believe would be their emotional experience. But once again, we can't truly say across one single modality, what is this person feeling? And,
I think that's so important to bring up. And it's something Michelle and I often lecture about when we discuss what is emotion. It's all of the theories of emotion that sometimes, even for validated scales, if they just have that scale validated through that one specific theory of emotion, it might work perfectly for one, but not for the other. And that's something to keep in mind. It's, under these pretenses and under these assumptions, it is validated and it shows. And so I appreciate you recognizing, the context and the nuance in how you even approach discussing emotions, because we all know, and you even said it yourself, that context is critical when you are trying to do this type of work and trying to do these types of analyses.
Right. And on top of that, it's about the dynamics of it, right? Is so even with self-reported like Likert scale types of validation for emotion, the first thing they tell you in psychology and neuro research is that self-reported scales are a terrible measure, right? Because we have this idea where people have their own preconceived biases, they have reactions, you know, especially in emotional context, right? Like
Right.
today I could walk outside and you know, spill my coffee on my shirt on my way to
Mhm.
work, and today it might be, you know, my end all be all, I've had a terrible day when that happens, but tomorrow that could happen to me and I could be like, well, I get to work, I have a spare shirt there, it's not the end of the day, and my
Yeah.
reaction to the same event is different as an individual day to day.
Well,
Whereas if
that's
you know, look at interpersonal interactions as well, like within an organization, then it's like, how do you model that complexity through one modality? How do you understand it? And so all of these things are important considerations that
But
we
that's
like
also the
to,
challenge, right? So
yeah.
the challenge in making this something that is more application oriented and not just, looking at the basic science of understanding why we feel the way
Mhm.
we feel and et cetera and so on, because that's one thing. But when it comes to making an application out of it, a big question that people have is this validated? And it is very challenging to validate anything because it is so fluid. And I think that's what people forget, that in the complexity that we are as humans, that means that context plays such a big role, that today I could feel this way, tomorrow I could feel another. And so the same exact scale could totally be different, even though it's the same exact scale. And I think that goes for even if you were using EEG
Right.
or heart rate or GSR or whatever it is. But also from person to person, because my version of happy is different than your version of happy, which is precisely the problem in psychology with a repeatability issue,
Mhm.
Mhm.
right? And a validation issue. And it's that's why you have some people in other sciences that look at psychology and see it as being softer,
Mhm.
Mhm.
which is unfair. I would think it's just more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think kind of the takeaway from it for me is like, it's okay to not have these problems be solved problems, right?
Right. They
And I
may never
think
be solved.
exactly.
Right.
And I
Right.
think we run into this kind of hype with AI and a lot of these different approaches where suddenly you have, you know, a model that does pattern recognition better than a human qual researcher and is able to extract, you know, topics at a very high level. And that's like, that's great, but can it understand the contextual links between different topics? Can it go beyond, you know, just being able to classify, oh, this is a good experience someone's having and this is a bad one, to, you know, this is an example of jealousy that's
Mhm.
based on this specific context, right? And
Right.
so
Yeah.
I think because there's kind of, and I think media plays a role into this as well, of kind of the point you were talking about earlier, Michelle, with we like simple frameworks that tell us things about how the brain works, and neuroscience is kind of sexy in that sense for from a news standpoint, right? It's
Mhm.
always cool to have this finding that you get from research that explains, you know, a personality trait or how we make decisions or something in a broader context, because people like reading about that. People like reading
Yeah.
about how their brain works, understanding a little bit more about that. But the dangers and the pitfalls of that can be that sometimes we, you know, place a lot of emphasis on those kinds of approaches instead of
Right.
kind of the actual, you know, what is the experimental design behind this?
Well, we
What are
think
the,
there is like a biomarker,
yeah.
right? Like there's like, is there a biomarker for depression? And the thing is, in some ways, yes, there are, neuroscience, biology related things, physiology related things to depression,
The
but then your
indicators.
actual
Yeah.
feeling of something in the moment is quite different. It's that emotional paradox that we
Mhm.
have. So one of the main reasons I was interested in neuroscience early on was because I was really hoping that there was a way to have biomarkers instead of relying on very subjective clinical diagnoses.
Mhm.
But it turns out it's a lot more complicated than that. It's not as simple as being able to do a brain scan and being able to know right off, what's going on with a person. We're just far too complicated. The brain is far too complicated for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And actually that's the example I was going to bring up. I had like a canned example that I
Yeah,
prepared, and it
sorry.
was the depression one. Because I'm sure you've been following the research kind of more recently that's talking about the effect of antidepressants in general
Mhm.
and their role in treatment and the comparisons to placebo that are being made now. And when you look at that research, it's shocking that you're like, wow, we were prescribing this, entire class of drugs that may or may not actually address the core issue at hand, and we don't know. But on the other hand, it's like you look at the number of people that those drugs have helped, and you can never say that back in, the early 2000s when we had these, I guess, like correlates of depression come out, you weren't going to not help people that were depressed, right?
Right.
And so does that make that model for depression invalid or not helpful? No, the same way that our current understanding of emotions could be entirely changed within the next 6 months in neuroscience. And does that make any of the precursor groundwork invalid? Also no, right? And I think that's what we need to kind of embrace within the industry. And I think that there's kind of this race right now to, build the most complex model, or the model that has the most kind of modalities and stuff built into it. But sometimes we have to take a step back and we have to say, well, at a certain point that loses its human element, right? Because when we talk about emotions and we talk about interacting as people and how we experience these, a variety of these different variables, we're not computers. We don't always make the most rational choice. We're not actively computing probabilities consciously, right? So it comes as like a fine line as a researcher, where you have to kind of, well, my view is we still need that kind of supervised human element to really build the rails for some of these models in specific contexts.
And that's something I thought was really interesting about what you said in your intro when you're talking about what you do with Heartbeat, and you talked about supervised and unsupervised. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that, because I think that when people hear AI and they hear about algorithms, they have a sort of innate trust that it's doing something. And I don't think everybody's familiar with they're not all familiar with this idea of supervised and unsupervised and what that might mean.
Yeah, sure. So I'll try to make the distinction kind of as just like lighthearted as possible. And of course, I'm not a technical expert, so I just like to say this on the record that I'm not a comp sci person. So if I say anything that comp sci people are like, that's totally wrong, I will take full blame for it, as that's not my area of expertise. But to kind of simplify the answer to that is, unsupervised learning is a class of machine learning based models. Currently, the kind of cutting edge ones of those are referred to as neural networks. And the idea is that you feed into this model some sort of training data, which is usually referred to as a corpus of text. So it could be anything, articles in academia, it could be social media posts. Basically, you just want to get a sense of the type of language that you're sampling. Once you have kind of that training data, and it can be modified as well. It can be tagged by human experts. You can identify contextual elements if you want, kind of identify emotions if you want. And then the model will take that training data where it has some pre-built human associations built into it. And then essentially it will, run an algorithm, and this algorithm will basically look at co-location of words in what we call semantic space. So what that would mean is, for example, if someone mentions, I'm going to go back to the airplane example, if someone mentions, good flight, and then in association with good flight, like 5 or 10 words later says comfortable seats. So this model will basically translate those words into numbers and then link how close they are in relation to each other contextually. And that's how you build out these things known as topics and themes. And so there's obviously a bunch of kind of statistics that goes into it and layers of computation, but eventually you get this output that essentially classifies all the text into different categories using this approach. And so this is done both at the sentiment level. Sometimes people bring in things like intensity. So if they want to kind of try to quantify how intense an emotion is being felt, there's ways to do that. Once again, it usually has to do with setting good and bad as like a baseline, and then looking at the proximity of words associated with those experiences. And so that would be the fully unsupervised approach. The reason why it's referred to as unsupervised is it's kind of like an easy bake oven. Once you put that training data in, with whatever biases it has. And so this is kind of, I guess, an important time to mention that everything has bias, because when you are loading training data in, for example, from internet-based sources, and people generally have this misconception that academia doesn't have bias, for example, because, scientific approach is supposed to be unbiased and whatever. No, academia is filled with plenty of bias.
I like to joke that if a human has touched something at any point,
yeah,
It is
Exactly.
inherent bias in it. Yes.
Yeah, and because that's what makes us innately human, right?
Yeah.
Everyone
Right.
learns, everyone has their collective experience that has brought them to this point as an academic professional, and that's formed their worldview. And
Yeah.
everything that you touch and that you encode, you're pouring your own worldview into that
Yeah.
work. And
It
so,
yeah.
yeah,
It's so interesting with bias in particular. I feel like that more than anything has this stigma around it that bias equals bad, when that is not the case at all. It's
You can
literally like,
lean into it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
exactly.
And there's learning. So I didn't mean to cut you off. Please continue with, because I know that there was, um, so you mentioned about the unsupervised versus supervised. Can you elaborate a little bit more about the supervised now and kind of
Yeah.
expand on that?
Yeah, so to just wrap up the unsupervised little spiel, so the easy bake oven analogy is you take all that training data that has all of the biases of the researchers and the people that have written that data and coded that data, you pop it in the oven, the computer crunches all of it and provides you with an output, and you have no control over individual layers.
Yeah.
So you can no longer go back in that model and say, okay, we have one contextual layer that's very simple, where we've identified really basic topics, like in the airplane analogy, seats, food, service, whatever else you might identify. You have an end output where the system has already optimized the context and optimized the sentiment, and you have no control over those individual layers that have latently been processed by the computer. When you have a supervised approach, the difference is, and at Heartbeat, we actually developed an NLP rule-based language for non-programmers. So they are able to, and NLP is natural language processing. So it's just, considered the area of computing that builds these rules to interpret text and, for specific tasks. And so one of the areas of NLP is sentiment analysis. One of it is, contextual analysis. And so we built this language within Heartbeat to allow non-programmers to be able to build out these rules. And so that's where that supervised approach comes in, is we're actually able to then go in between those computational layers as best as we can. Obviously, we lose a bit of the power of a neural network because we're not leveraging that neural network in that point in time, but we are still able to leverage AI-based approaches from natural language processing in kind of a sequence to build out the context that we think is more accurate from a, I guess, human perspective. And so,
And with this being said, I am curious, and this is something we talk about a lot with natural language processing, as language as a whole is constantly, it's fluid, it's changing, people are making new words constantly. And so how do you go about doing this type of work with the consideration that the models that you have historically might not work in the next week, the next month, with the next TikTok trend, you know?
right. And so that kind of comes from that supervised approach. And
Mm,
so what we're able to do is we're able to identify these new terms. We're able to build out new rules for them in relation to the context. So for example, a prominent thing that we did was with the word nostalgia, right? So we were doing some Disney related work about streaming services and how people react to them. And so the focus was to understand, what are the emotional drivers of someone's experience when they're watching these shows as an adult, for example. And a lot of people would use the word nostalgia in a very positive context. It takes me back to my childhood, whereas nostalgia in a very different context could be encoded as melancholy or,
mm,
sad or
Yeah.
etc. And so it's really about understanding that context. And in a supervised approach, you're able to automatically adjust the model by creating a new rule, which will, go back and be applied at a certain layer. And so the way that we do that is we look at a window of words around a target word. So say we find that nostalgia, we look at, roughly plus or minus 5 words around it. We try to extrapolate the context, and based on that context, we build a rule that says, okay, when people mention nostalgia in the context of a Disney movie, we are going to encode it as a positive emotion in this specific case. And so
Yeah.
then when we move it to another context, we just disable that rule and we go back to kind of the base model. Whereas with the unsupervised approach, at least traditionally, when we had to rely on that training data, obviously with like GPT-4 and some of the large language models, they don't actually need training data anymore, but you do need to change that context and change those biases to accommodate for, what is the change in language if they haven't seen it before at any level.
And what is your thought in terms of, with both the supervised and unsupervised, Obviously, it's going to be contextual and dependent on situations about which is most beneficial. But how do you feel like these advances that you're making with these NLP techniques are going to further our understanding of these text analyses that you're doing? What is the ultimate goal that you're asked a lot about, but also that you believe can be achieved with this tool and this technique?
Right. I think this kind of hits on a lot of things. So I think one of the most interesting applications of it, and this is kind of a lot of people in analytics are concerned about AI kind of replacing the need for analytics teams. And that's like a really real fear, right? And ultimately presented as like the end goal of a lot of these text analytics models is to have, the complete pipeline from taking in data to analyzing it to automating insights based on that data. That would be kind of the dream for industry, right? Where you're able to instantaneously get these results in a near real-time basis for whatever data you're throwing into it. The kind of, the disclaimer that I would post with that kind of vision for AI is that to my at least opinion, that's vastly overestimating the capabilities of AI today and vastly underestimating the complexity of human behavior. And that's why for unsupervised learning, kind of what our goal is how much can we borrow of that computing power and what is, being done really well, like things like pattern recognition, like pulling out these topics. That's being done at a very high level within some of the newer kind of AI-based approaches. What's really lacking is still our understanding of emotion, because kind of, as we talked about earlier, quantifying emotions is really, really hard. And unfortunately, computers, when they quantify things, they are stuck to a very rigid logical structure. People are not, right? And so until we're able to mimic that, I guess, like weird hybrid space between here is math logic and here is human math logic, then we're not really going to be able to.
And funny. Kathryn and I have talked about that very real issue. And we talked about, Kathryn has a lot of sisters, and we were kind of talking about this in terms of decision making, right? So if you had one cookie left and you had to decide how to split it amongst two sisters, the math approach or the computer approach would be, well, obviously you cut it in half and each one gets an equal half. But we know that there's a lot of other contexts that can come into that. It could be that we know, for example, that the cookie never breaks in half. It's going to be that there's going to be one that is going to be bigger than the other. And then there's deals you can make. Or someone's just faster than you and they're like, oh yeah, I'm just going to eat it. So we know the reality of a situation among siblings, right? That they're going to argue about the size or one's going to be faster. And so there are different concessions you can make. So one might be that one sibling could say, you know what, I'll let you choose what we watch on TV later if you let me have the bigger half. Or I think you had an option as well, Kathryn, from babysitting days, right?
Yes. And basically the way that it worked is if you had two people, you had one person that cut the treat. So they cut the cookie in half, and then the other person got to decide which half they got. So it kind of gave both of them a job or a sense of agency over, how to cut it. And that was
and
the
it's
most
fair. But this idea of fairness is something that can be very contextual and very fluid, and can be very challenging for a computer. So I guess the question then becomes, things are rapidly changing, right? And these predictive systems and these AI systems are getting better. So, with this whole idea of supervised and unsupervised and questions around whether, human analysts are going to be replaced at some time, what do you see happening in the future?
Well, I'm a big believer in the hybrid approach. I think, for example, it obviously depends on the context, but I think you can find nuance in every industry where there needs to be a human context in it. The easiest example would be in terms of diversity, inclusivity, and equity. Fairness is not really a great concept there because equity is not based on equality and fairness is. So for example, I don't see within the near future how you could train an AI approach to have the same equity-based lens as someone who's an expert in the field that's studied it. Because, how do you train intersectionality? How do you build in tons of historical biases
Are
against
you
women.
suggesting there is a value to getting a PhD in philosophy?
I am 100% about it. I have actually, that's been my latest
Is
hobby.
it coming back?
Yeah, I mean, I think philosophy is beautiful, and I think that, you know, one of the things that I really struggle with sometimes in neuroscience is we tend to look at a field that largely binds together what 5+ disciplines. So you look at psychology, you look at chemistry, you look at biology. You can put neuro in front of each one of those words
Yeah.
and sound really smart and have
Yeah.
it come directly into the field. On top of that, when we look at, you know, neuroscience and behavior in the context of people and groups, then that's sociology automatically. Once you bring in sociology, then that's philosophy, anthropology. Like, you could really continue building this cocktail
You
of,
really
you know,
could.
human
Yeah.
understanding. And I think there is kind of value in every layered lens, right? Because that's how we build understanding about all of these things, is in neuroscience basic research. And I hate the term basic research. As someone who did basic research for a while in high school, I find
Yeah.
it so kind of polarizing and
It
inconsequential. And
kind
it's
of
like,
sounds negative.
Yeah, it's
exactly.
minimizing. Yeah.
Yeah, but the implications of basic
Yeah.
research, understanding how neurons work, understanding, you know, in my context, I'm a bit biased, but no one seems to care about this, was I did a big project on looking at edge alignment and how it incites visual awareness. So usually
Right.
when you have a straight edge, you become visually aware of it quicker.
Mhm.
And so that kind of work is like, in your day-to-day, that's never going to make the news, but that work might
It's
help our
crucial.
understanding of visual awareness, right?
But
And so
also really important to how we're, kind of jumping the gun on AI as well, on being able to make visual decisions. So,
Yeah.
why is it that, humans can fill in gaps better, right? And it is because there's an order of operations and importance that we attribute to different things, like whether or not it's a straight edge and we need to
It's funny
see
you
it right
even
away.
it's funny you even bring that up with AI, because with a lot of the generative AI photos, people miss it because of what you just said, where we are really good at making assumptions and filling in the gaps that, you don't realize that the hand is elongated unless it's specifically pointed out to you that there is, these curves and edges that shouldn't be there. But then when you actually look at the photo and you really laser focus into it, you start to see the inadequacies in the AI
The
generated
assumptions that are
photo.
made, the hallucinations. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think what you were saying specifically about just bringing this to the analytics and the importance of the analytics teams and the people that are behind these interpretations is just that AI can only go off of the data that it has, and it will never be able to create. And that is something that people confuse. Generating versus creating is two separate things.
And I think that is why I really appreciate the approach that you've explained to us, Dan, about what Heartbeat AI is doing, because I really do like that sort of combined approach and really, thinking about context, and makes a lot of sense.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And one thing I want to bring up before we wrap things up, because this has been such a great conversation, is that, and I know you're aware of this because you've talked to Michelle and I for a bit, but I do want to also ask you, what are the best applications for this type of tool? But then what are also the limitations and places you would say to people, maybe look for another tool, maybe look for something else that it's not best applied here?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't by any means want to be the judge, jury, and executioner of these things, but I think off the top of my head, one of the ways that I think these kinds of frameworks of understanding of people's experiences can be applied very effectively nowadays, and this is just strictly speaking from, I guess, the quality of data available and kind of the approach to industry-based research in these fields, is market research and the HR space, and in the healthcare side, on the patient experience side and the healthcare provider experience side. So I think what's really critical about those areas and critical about the challenges that we see within those areas is, for example, on the market research side, there's a really big need now, I think, as values change. And I don't want to really say generationally, but I think we're going through a period of, social change across a lot of different perspectives that we have on products, on the social accountability of brands, for example. I think anything that has to measure that and provide some sort of, as close to objective as possible way to get at, how do people actually care about the sustainability of a brand versus, whether that brand supports a particular issue that's going on currently. I think being able to quantify that response and understand, what does my customer demographic actually care about, and what are they going to, prefer or support the brand more, especially with like TikTok blowing up, I think, where you have a lot of people that have the opportunity to voice their opinion on a brand or voice their opinion on their interaction with something in a very informal and uncontrolled sort of way. I think then that bodes kind of a place for, it's important to research that, and it's important to research, what is relevant to that customer base. The same way that when we look at employees in an organization, we're kind of becoming more and more aware of the sense of what is a sense of belonging at work, both through the diversity inclusivity lens, but also through a career progression lens. And then I guess our best cases of application is being able to show that macro level of, I'm going to use the organization example for this one, but for example, women within an organization and their experiences with career progression versus men is a big one, for example, right? And we historically haven't been able to put those two issues on a pedestal and compare them in a way that's been productive without, dismissing one perspective or the other.
Right.
And so what this allows us to do, because we're measuring the language at the source of how people are communicating it, that allows us to say that, look, there are these fundamental differences in how people speak about this. And so that kind of speaks to that unspoken bias or that taboo that exists, where we are seeing these groups that are affected by these things at, very different rates than other groups. And highlighting that is important, because then you can go to management or you can go to the brand strategist and say, look, you are actively, neglecting the needs of this group. Maybe you're overemphasizing the needs of this group. And that's when it connects to kind of that bottom line of, well, how do you optimize, the interactions that your product has with these groups, or what your organizational culture is like for these people. And that's when you're able to say that, look, that human approach of semi-supervised learning, we built this out based on these principles that come from sociology and these other disciplines. And now we're able to understand it and give you a prioritized action that's going to make everyone happy with how that cookie is split.
Right.
And so that's, or at least it's going to make the most amount of people as happy as possible. How that cookie is split.
Absolutely. And I
Great
mean,
way to bring it back to the analogy too.
I think that was a great way to summarize the conversation, honestly. And Dan, this has been really insightful. Are you ready now to be put on, the hot seat for our React Attack game?
I am indeed.
Okay, so I do have the 10 words all written out for you. They are varying words from our conversation, but also just random spews of consciousness that I had. So without further ado, I'm going to start with something quite simple: the mind.
The brain.
Language modeling.
Insanely complex.
Behavior.
Sometimes unpredictable.
Priming.
Happens everywhere.
Sentiment analysis.
Not a complete view of emotions.
Mental health.
The goal.
Sampling.
Challenging and needs more attention than it gets.
Chat GPT.
All the rage, fun to talk to, tells terrible jokes.
Bias.
Everywhere and normal.
And then the last one, cookies.
Chocolate chip, occasionally oatmeal.
You could have both,
You could, yeah. But it's a bit much for me at that point.
Dan, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great conversation. If people wanted to get in touch with you and speak with you, where could they find you and where could they reach out?
Yeah, so the primary route of contact would be through my LinkedIn. So I've shared the link through with you guys. And then feel free to also, if you're interested in Heartbeat, connect with Lana, who's our CEO, my mentor. So her LinkedIn should be shared there as well. And lastly, if you're interested in the work that we do or kind of our values, approaches, etc., find us on our website.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. And until next time, please stay curious.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you so much.
For more information or updates, follow HCD Research on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at HCD Research Inc. and at HCD Neuroscience. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to rate, review, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you, and stay tuned for more curious conversations.